Ave Maris Stella.
Welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I am a priest of the Church of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the Star Cross Production Network at sqpn.com. Today we're going to give a general overview of Nostra, Aetate, an interview with Father Samir Advani, LC from Regina Apostolorum Pontifical Athenaeum in Rome. Welcome to the podcast, Father Samir.
It's very good to be here. Thanks for the invitation, Father Matthew.
If anybody wants to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. Vatican II has many documents, and as you know from this podcast, we're taking in the chronological order of their approval. Nostra Aetate means in our time, is what it means. It's the subtitle, which kind of explains it, is Declaration of the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions. It's most known for being the first council document focused on Jewish-Christian relationship, but we're also going to talk about the relationship between Christians and Muslims, Christians and pagans, and things like that. And it is the shortest document of the Vatican II documents. It's only about 1,700 words. The vote was 2,222 to 88. So it was still over 99.5% of the bishops supported it. It wasn't, some of the documents we have like 3 not supporting it, but this one still had well over 99% of the support from the bishops of Vatican II. So a little introduction for Father Samir. He has Indian and German origin. He's a priest in my own congregation, the Church of Christ. He's a professor of dogmatic theology at Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum. He directs the Christianity and Culture program, and he's a scholar in the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights. And is the author of Ratio on Religious Pluralism, published last year by Emmaus Road. Welcome to the podcast. Well, I already welcomed you. So we'll get into that, the Ratio part, towards the end of our podcast here today. To introduce Nostra Aetate, we have 3 parts of the interview. We're going to talk about the history relationship of the church with other religions. We're going to talk about the key themes of the document, and then we're going to talk about action of the church since Nostra Aetate, which will include Ratzinger, because he's a very important figure since then. So here we have this document's really dealing with Catholicism and other non-Christian religions, right? We have a separate document on ecumenism, and ecumenism is talking about with other Christian religions, whether they're Orthodox or Protestant. And here I think the document really divides kind of into 3, as far as I see it, which is the Jews, Islam, and others vaguely Christian and non-Abrahamic religions there. So I'm just going to go on the history in those 3 groups. So starting with the Jews, all 12 of the apostles were Jewish, and Christianity started as an offshoot of Judaism. When would you say the formal break was? What caused a break between Judaism and Christianity in the early church?
Sure. Well, so just a word perhaps before we get into the specifics of that. I thank you, of course, once again for the invitation. And like you mentioned, Father Matthew, both Nostra Aetate and the church's document on the church, the council's document on the church, Lumen Gentium, deal with similar themes. So I always recommend people who want to study this theme in the council to read Nostra Aetate together with numbers 13 to 17 of Lumen Gentium, the document, the constitution on the church. And the order, the reason I mentioned that is the ordering of the religions in those 2 documents is sort of inverse, right? So in Lumen Gentium, we talk about the church's relationship in those numbers, first with the Jews, then with Muslims, and then with other religions, and then even with people who don't know God explicitly, and you could say perhaps the atheists are in there. Whereas in Nostra Aetate, it sort of starts bottom up, right? So in Lumen Gentium, we start with those who are closest to the Catholic Church, the Jews, and then you work your way down, if you will. Whereas in Nostra Aetate, you work your way up, and so you start with the Hindus and the Buddhists, and then you get to the Muslims, and then you get to the Jews, right? So that's interesting. Now, your question was specifically about the relationship with the Jews and how, at what point did Christianity sort of separate itself, separate itself as a distinct religion from the Jewish people. And of course, we know that Jesus himself was a Jew, the apostles were all Jews, the early disciples were all Jews. And so really at the very beginning, after Jesus' death, Christianity sees itself as very much a Jewish religion. And we continuously see in the Acts of the Apostles that Peter and the other apostles are preaching in the synagogues and in the temple. And the Jews also see these Christians, this new group, as a member of their religion, right? And that's why then the sort of tension between the two, precisely in trying to distinguish what is the relationship between the old and the new. I think things sort of got to a head, let's say, with the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. So there's a Jewish revolt against a Roman occupation. And as a result, in the year 70, the temple is destroyed. And because of that, the Christians, for their part, see this as a sign of sort of the definitive separation from the Jewish people. In the meantime, remember as well, due to Paul, Christianity is spreading out outside the Jewish groups, right? Paul is preaching to the Gentiles. And so you get an increasingly large number, just in numerical, sociological terms. The church, these first early Christian communities, are becoming increasingly non-Jewish in origin. And then you have this destruction of the temple, which the Christians take sort of symbolically as the break with the old and sort of the start of a new religion. And from the Jewish side, that destruction of the temple is also very important because it marks the birth of rabbinical Judaism. And so really after the destruction of the temple, the Jews want to preserve their identity and their purity even more than before. And so really they distinguish themselves very clearly from the Christians, and they see the Christians even more absolutely than before, if you will, as non-Jews, and the Christians are excluded from the Jewish synagogues and the Jewish communities. And really by the year 132, 135, there's another revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt against the Romans, in which the Christians decide not to support the Jews, not to support the Jews against the Romans. And so really, I would say those two, if you want dates, if you want events that sort of mark this process of separation, I would say the destruction of the temple in 70, and then the revolt, the second revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132, 135.
Okay, and what was the relationship between Christians and Jews, or what kind of main themes can we talk about in the next 1800 years, from that time in 70 or 132 AD until the early 1900s, up to World War II and things like that? What kind of relationships were there between the Christians and Jews in that period?
Right. So obviously that's a very long period of time. And so the relationship goes through many phases and ups and downs. And it also depends a lot, obviously, upon the country or the different countries, right? In very general terms, let's say that in the first 2 centuries, first 3 centuries, while Christianity is still a persecuted religion, there is this sort of tension between the two, but each of them are increasingly going in their separate ways. Once Christianity becomes officially recognized by the Roman Empire in 315, and then becomes the official state religion in 380 under Theodosius, that's when things get far more interesting, because now Christianity is in the ascent, and it sort of has to take an official position vis-a-vis the Jews. And so there are councils and there are edicts that restrict Jewish rights, that ban, for example, intermarriage, that ban the Jews from holding certain public offices. In 1096, you have, of course, the First Crusade. And so in this great zeal to recover the Holy Land from the Muslims, we'll talk about the Muslims a little later in this interview, but in that zeal of reconquering the Holy Land, there's a lot of anti-Jewish sentiment that also rises to the fore. And very importantly, in 1120, Pope Calixtus II publishes a bull, Sicut Judaeis, which is then reaffirmed by more than 20 popes after him, which guarantees the protection of the Jews. And it emphasizes that even though the Jews reject Christ, they're not to be killed, they're not to be forcibly converted, they're not to have their property taken, confiscated away from them. So there is this great effort of on the part of the church to recognize and to even protect the Jews. But of course, we have to recognize that the implementation of this bull was not uniform throughout all Christian lands, throughout all of Europe, and so it also depended a lot on political factors, right? And so this interplay between the church and the state also affected relationships between the Jews. We have to admit, in this political vein, that there were official expulsions of the Jews from England in 1290, from France in 1306, and then again in 1394, and in Spain in 1492 in the context of the Reconquista, of the reconquest of Spain. And so at times the Jews were also confined to specific areas. You get the Jewish ghettos. And so really I would say the history is this very sort of mixed history of discrimination, but also of attempts by the church to limit this, to protect the rights of the Jews. And so it's a very uneven black and white mixture. Once you have the Reformation and sort of the growth of Enlightenment secular thought, on the one hand, again, you have a protection of the Jews in France. 1791 was the first legal emancipation of the Jews. But at the same time, this Enlightenment secular thought has its dangers, and the great rise of anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, which then leads to the Holocaust in the Second World War, is precisely because of the collapse of religious sentiment and precisely because of the lack of, let's say, the church's protection of the Jews. And so really the whole history is marked by these tensions, and it's certainly not the ideal situation, but we also need to recognize the attempts by the church to protect the Jews against unlawful discrimination.
Yes, I think that there is a lot of, like you're saying, it's very mixed with the Judaism, where it's like the church is like, hey, we don't discriminate, but then secular leaders want to do it, and how it's all going back and forth. We have a somewhat similar thing with Islam, where Islam, they do want to worship the God of Abraham. They see Jesus. They do think of Jesus as having some kind of revelation, although they obviously just see him as a prophet and see Muhammad as a greater prophet. But how would you see the relationship between Muslims and Christians throughout history, and what kind of issues were really the big issues between us over history? Because obviously we've had battles and things like that, and we've had a lot of different disagreements, but we also had things where we worked together. So,
yes, I think with the Muslims, the history is more political, precisely because Islam itself is a far more political religion, where religion and state and politics are combined together. So, from a historical perspective, Islam is born in the 6th century, 6th, 7th century. And after Muhammad's death, the first 100 years of Islam is a history of expansion, where you have the great conquest of different countries, of different lands by the Muslim powers. But those lands were largely Christian lands, right? So you have the conquest of many parts of the Byzantine Empire. You have the conquest of all of North Africa, and then even the entrance into Spain. And so really there is, from the very beginning, this sort of antagonistic, very political, very militaristic relationship between Christians and Muslims, and between Christian states and Islamic states, right? Under Muslim rule, how were the Christians treated? Well, the Muslims recognize that Christians are people of the book. So they do have a particular status. The Muslims, of course, recognize that Jesus was a prophet. They don't recognize Jesus as the Son of God, but they do recognize him as a prophet. They have particular devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. the daughter of Muhammad, in fact, was called Fatima. And so, which of course for us Catholics, although this is not until the 20th century, we have the apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. And so there are theological points of contact. So how were Christians treated then in these conquered Islamic lands? They were given protected status, but as second-class citizens. So there was what's called the dhimmi status. They had to pay a special tax, the jizya, which protected them if they could pay this tax, but they were restricted in their religious and political life. And as long as then they paid this tax and followed these restrictions, they had some sort of religious liberty and autonomy in their own communities. At the same time, and I think it's very important to recognize this, there was a vast and extremely well-organized Muslim slave trade for over 1,000 years, from the 7th to the 19th century. Now, Islam allows slavery, but it very clearly says that no Muslim can be sold as a slave. And so ipso facto, who were the people sold as slaves were the conquered peoples. So conquered Christians, also non-Christians, but hundreds of thousands of Christians were sold as slaves in conquered Muslim lands from North Africa, from Spain, later on in the Ottoman lands when they conquered the Balkans. And even up until the 19th century, you had Muslim pirates raiding Mediterranean Christian lands, Spain, France, Italy, and really capturing Christians and selling them as slaves. So there was these political factors were very present, and I would say that the relationship is far more marked in these militaristic terms. Then, of course, in the 1490s, you had the reconquest of Spain by the Catholic powers. You have the rise. You have in 1453 the conquest of Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire falls and becomes a Muslim state. You have the rise of the Ottoman Turks, and then their attempt to conquer Christian Europe, not from the west, so not from Spain, but from the east, so the Balkans. And so you have a whole series of sieges of Vienna. You have the Battle of Lepanto, which is a sea battle. And so really there is this very difficult sort of history. And then finally, I would say in the late 19th and 20th centuries, with the sort of collapse of the Ottoman Empire, you have colonialism especially by the British and French powers in the Middle East. And so formerly Ottoman powers and therefore Muslim states are now under nominally Christian, let's say, Western countries under their authority. And so, yes, the relationship with Islam, I think, is marked much more by political and, above all, militaristic tension, wars, and friction between the two powers. You do have collaboration. You have, of course, philosophically and theologically in the Abbasid Caliphate, especially in cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, Christian scholars who contribute to science, to medicine, to philosophy. You have a lot of the translation of the Greek works of Aristotle done by Arabs, and these then are used by Christian philosophers in the West, by St. Thomas and others. And so there is also at a philosophical and theological level debate, attempt to understand each other's positions and really argue for the truth of faith. But these attempts, I think, are overshadowed by the much larger political militaristic context.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, so these we've talked so far about the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Now, moving to non-Abrahamic religions, we have a whole spectrum of other religions. Some of them are monotheistic, like these, where they have one God. You think of something like Zoroastrianism or certain interpretations of Hinduism. Other ones are polytheistic, where they have a whole collection of gods. What kind of relationship has the church had with these religions over history? Before Vatican II, what kind of relationship do we have with Hindus or Zoroastrians or the Greek and Roman gods? The worshippers of Greek and Roman gods, and historically.
Yeah, that's an even more complex theme, right? So obviously, when Christianity is born, it's, as we sort of mentioned, it's born in a Jewish world, but that Jewish world is immersed in a larger Roman, Greek, polytheistic world. And so at the very beginning, again, there is a very fierce persecution by the Roman state against the Christian communities. I mean, I live here in Rome, and we have so many exemplary martyrs who were killed by the Romans for their faith in those first 3 centuries, right? Saint Sebastian, Saint Agnes, Saint Clement, Peter and Paul, the martyrs, the apostles of Rome were martyred here. And so really, again, because in Roman religion and state really are intertwined. And so not to give religious cult to the emperor is considered a political crime and is considered in some sense to be an act of subversion against the state. And so Christians had the great courage to stand up for their faith and profess really their faith in Christ as true God in the face of this very, at times, very bloody persecution. And then once Christianity is recognized by the Roman Empire and that becomes the official religion, you have the great attempts of evangelization, right? So you have the work with the Germanic peoples beyond the Danube who have not yet become Romanized. Saint Boniface, for example, you have the work with the Slavic people, Saint Cyril and Methodius. And so you have these great attempts of evangelization. But the church, let's say the attitude towards these pagan religions was always one of deep suspicion, recognizing the limitations of these religions, recognizing that these gods were not the true gods, and that the people who follow these gods needed to convert, needed to accept Christianity, needed to accept Jesus and be baptized if they wanted to be saved. Now, of course, by the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, the whole world, and by this we mean the whole known world, Europe, right, is essentially Christian. And so this direct contact, immediate contact with pagan people, with those who are not Jews or not Muslims, has disappeared. And St. Thomas, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas was convinced that the whole world had become Christian or were at least, close to Christianity as Jews or as Muslims. And so the presence of paganism had essentially disappeared. This farce, of course, right, came crumbling down with the discovery of the New Worlds, with the discovery of the Americas. And then as the colonial period begins, right, contact with the East, contact with the religions, the tribal religions of Africa, contact with the very advanced religions and philosophies of the Indian subcontinent. Of Hinduism is a blanket term we use to actually cover a whole wide array of different religions, different texts. There is no central authority in what we call Hinduism. So you can call it Hinduism, which is sort of a Western term that has been invented to talk about really the different religions, the many different religions of the Indian subcontinent. There's Buddhism, there's Shintoism, there's Confucianism. Buddhism itself exists in very many forms. And so really the church, when it comes into contact with this startling variety, its first approach, let's say, was that of mission and evangelization and preaching the good news of Jesus Christ to these people, purifying them of their many errors. Let's also not forget that many of these religions accepted and favored very barbaric practices. We can think about human sacrifices. The Aztec religion, for example, in India, the worship of Kali, who's the goddess of death, which often included very barbaric practices. And so there was a great effort by the church to purify these religions of their errors. And above all, to preach the liberation and the good news of Christ to them. Right now, the I don't know how much I should speak about this because this is going to go on, and maybe we'll get back to it. Right? The model that motivated all of these efforts of evangelization was that outside the church there is no salvation, which was understood in a restrictive sense as those who are not baptized cannot be saved. Although then that led to lots of discussions about what it really meant to be a member of the church. But anyway, the overall model or paradigm was preach Christ to them, help these people to discover the joy, the liberation, the truth of Christ, and to become members of the church through baptism. So in very, very, very generic terms, that any expert is going to poke holes in the blink of an eye, but I'd say just in very generic terms, that sort of is the history of the relationship between the church and these other non-Abrahamic, non-monotheistic religions before the Second Vatican Council.
Okay, so that gives us kind of the background, what we had before Nostra Aetate. And now I want to go over the document itself, Nostra Aetate. Obviously, it's not that long, we mentioned in the intro. And beyond an introduction and conclusion, the document has 3 paragraphs, each on the groups regressively closer to Christian belief. As you noted, we start with the kind of non-Abrahamic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Greco-Roman, Native American, different groups like that. And what does the document say about those kind of groups? What does it say about the Catholic Church's relationship with all those different religions?
Right. So Nostra Aetate, like you mentioned, is the shortest of all the conciliar documents. It's only 5 numbers, right? So it's really short. And I'm not sure if we're going to discuss this afterwards, but perhaps a word on how this document was born can be helpful to our listeners, because really this document started out as a part of Lumen Gentium, which is the constitution on the church in the council. And really it started out with what is currently just number 4 of Nostra Aetate, which is the number on the Jews. And the council fathers, especially after the Second World War, after the Holocaust, thought that it was important to have a number about the church's relationship with the Jews. What happened was that the bishops in the mission territories said, well, if you're going to talk about the Jews, you also have to talk about the other religions. And so first it was the question, if you're going to talk about the Jews, you have to talk about the relationship with Islam. And then the missionaries in India and China and Africa said, well, if you're going to talk about the Jews and about the Muslims, you have to also talk about the other religions. And so really what happened is that rather than adding on another 5 or 6 numbers to Lumen Gentium and making that document even longer, what was finally decided on was to separate these paragraphs and make a separate document on them, which is why I really I want to underline that if you want to study what the church in the council says about the other religions and our attitude towards the other religions, you can't read Nostra Aetate alone. You need to read Nostra Aetate together with those 5 or 6 numbers in Lumen Gentium that deal with this topic, which is Lumen Gentium 13 to 17, because this really is born in that context and in some sense is a continuation of what is already stated there. So Nostra Aetate 1 is very generic, and what it says is, what do we have in common with all religions, right? And it says all men have a common origin and end, which is God. And that God's providence extends to all men. He has a saving plan for all men. And all men are looking in their religions to find the answers to those deepest questions about the meaning of life that are buried in their heart. Who am I? What is the meaning of life? Why do I suffer? What is the meaning of suffering? What is death? Where do I come from? Where do I go? Right? Where am I going? So that's the context. Man who is searching for God, who is searching for the meaning of life and the answer to the most difficult questions of life in his religions. And so then Nostra Aetate 2 says the first group of answers that we find to these questions are precisely in the religions where there is a certain recognition of a supreme power that governs history, that governs all people, and at times, this recognition of this power has even led to the recognition that there is a personal God, so a supreme being, a father, who is behind this power, this anonymous power that governs all things, right? And then it says, so these in generic terms, at this first level, let's say, of reflection of religious search for the meaning of life, it mentions explicitly Hinduism and then Buddhism. And it says, in Hinduism, men contemplate the divine mystery. And really that is the heart of Hinduism, trying to understand the great mystery of God and the expression of this great mystery and presence of God in multiple forms, in the forms of many myths, in philosophical inquiry, trying to give right worship to God in some sense through many different rites and practices, through ascetical practices, through profound meditation, and even in some forms of Hinduism, like the bhakti forms of Hinduism, through the sort of personal relationship of love and trust in God as a person, right? In Buddhism, which is more philosophical in nature, at least in its higher forms, there is the realization of the radical insufficiency of this world and everything in this world. That, money and power, and even human relationships, even the best of human relationships, everything that we find in this world is insufficient to satisfy man. And so man is again searching for what comes beyond, and that a life saturated only with what is found here will leave him ultimately unhappy, searching, unsatisfied, right? And so Buddhism is this attempt to teach man to free himself from all of these things that sort of chain him and enslave him and offer him false promises of fulfillment within this earth. Very importantly, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, I thought you were finishing. Go ahead, finish up.
No, that's fine. I just want let me just add this about Nostra Aetate 2, and then I'll just mention it, and perhaps we can talk about it later. So after the second paragraph talks in these generic terms about Hinduism and about Buddhism, it then gives a judgment. It gives a judgment about these religions. And it says that the Catholic Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in these religions. And she regards with sincere reverence all of these good and holy elements, right? So, Nostra Aetate has sometimes been criticized for only speaking positively about the other religions. And I think that criticism is valid if you only look at Nostra Aetate. If you look at Nostra Aetate in the context of Lumen Gentium makes this distinction and says, we see the positive elements and we recognize their value and we recognize the presence of these true and good and holy elements in the religions, but we also recognize their errors. And these errors have to be corrected and purified. That negative part of let's talk about the errors and the need of the church to purify these religions of the errors is not found in Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate only speaks in positive terms, and it lists the positive elements in these other religions. And I think that's also important, because human nature is to see what divides us and to see what the problems in the other are. And we all know by experience, what is wrong with the other religions or with my neighbor. And so the church is saying, without denying those errors, and this is very important, the church does not deny the errors. It does not say that all religions are the same. Without denying the errors, it says, don't forget that in addition to the errors, there are also positive things. And so it sort of fleshes out a little bit what those positive elements are.
Excellent. Now we move on to the Muslims, the next one. What does the document say about the Muslims? And I think one of the specific issues certain Catholics have brought up in more recent years is that Vatican II affirms that Muslims worship the same God as Christians, although they misunderstand him, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we might say. What what does it say about Muslims, and how does it talk about their worship of God as worship of the true God, albeit with some misunderstanding?
Right. So that is that is a very difficult question to answer. Do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? And the council is actually very nuanced in its reply, right? So first, I'm just going to say what the council does say, and then what it doesn't say, and then how we can answer this question, right? So in Nostra Aetate, the council says that the church regards with esteem the Muslims. So, we should esteem our Muslims, our Muslim brothers. And then it lists a whole series of elements that we have in common with them. And it says, they adore the one God, living and subsisting in himself. Muslims take pains to obey God's will, to submit themselves to God's will. They do not acknowledge Jesus as God, but they revere him as a prophet. They honor Mary. They await the day of judgment. They value moral life. They worship God through prayer, through almsgiving and fasting, right? So these are elements that we have in common and that we really should value, and I'll use the word of the council again, esteem, right? It's not just recognize, but esteem. And so it says, precisely because of the history of such great tension, it says we should then work for mutual understanding to clear up prejudices, right? Work for mutual understanding and preserve and promote together for the good of all mankind those elements of peace and freedom that we have in common, right? In Lumen Gentium, in number 16, the formulation is far shorter, and it says, this plan of salvation of God includes those who acknowledge the Creator. In the first place among these are the Muslims who profess to hold the faith of Abraham, along with us, adore the one and merciful God, who on the last day will judge mankind. So it doesn't say that they really do worship the one true God. It says they profess to worship the one true God. They acknowledge, right? So it's put in subjective rather than objective terms. According to the Muslims, in their mind, they are worshiping the one true God. Okay. And so I think this distinction is important, right? Because is the God of the Christians the same as the God of the Muslims? Well, that depends on what you mean by the question, right? So it's always yes and no. The answer is always yes and no. Is it the same God, like metaphysically speaking, the one God who is creator of all? In that sense, yes. But religion is not just about, the objective. It's also about the subjective. It's about, what do I know about this God? What do I understand about this God? Everything that is included in the name, let's say Jesus, or in the name, or not even Jesus, let's say God the Father from a Christian perspective, right? Because the Muslims won't recognize the divinity of the Son, and Allah. Is there any distinction between when a Christian says, I worship God the Father, and the Muslim says, I worship Allah? Yes, of course there are distinctions. Because the concept of Allah and everything that is related to God under the name Allah is not exactly the same as everything that is in the concept and related to the name of God the Father, right? The Muslim would not call God Father a fundamental category for us, right? God truly is our Father. And the Muslims recognize or pay so much attention to the majesty of God, the transcendence of God, the glory of God, the infinite distance between creature and creator, that for them it is blasphemous. It is terrible. It is a sin to call God Father, right? I remember many years ago, I read a small book about a convert from Islam to Christianity, a very interesting book. But the title of the book was, I Dared to Call Him Father. I dared to call him Father. So is Allah the same as God the Father? No, in that sense, right? The understanding of God, of who God is there overlap between Christians and Muslims? Yes. is can the concepts be mapped onto each other? Not immediately, right? So there are real differences in our understanding of who God is, in addition to the many points that we have in common.
Excellent. Now, our final group here are the Jews. What does the document talk about in the relationship between Christians and Jews?
So here then the language is is even warmer, right? So Nostra Aetate, let's start there. It says there is a special bond. So this is not just esteem, right? With the Hinduism and Buddhism, it says we respect them and we can even hold those positive elements that they contain with reverence. With Muslims, it goes a step further and it says we need to esteem them. But then with Jews, there really is almost this warm sort of language, and it says there is a special bond that unites Christians and Muslims. And it says the church should not forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament from the Jews. And she draws sustenance. This is really strong language, right? She draws sustenance. She lives, right? She feeds on the root of that well-cultivated olive tree onto which we have been grafted, the wild shoots, the Gentiles. I mean, that's obviously a citation, but really, in a certain sense, I mean, the council doesn't use this language, but the theology behind it, let's say, the implicit theology is we're not separated from the Jews. We are a shoot from the same vine, right? Another legionary priest here in Rome in my community has written his doctoral thesis on Israel as as Christianity as fulfilled Israel. The church has fulfilled Israel. It's Israel in its most complete form, right? And so the church says we have this great bond of a common root, right? John Paul II will talk about them as our elder brothers in the faith. That's not the council itself, right? And then the council wants to correct any false misinterpretation or antagonism or discrimination. And so it says, even though the Jews did not accept Christ, right? And even though several, it uses the negative, not a few, were opposed to the spread of the gospel. So without watering down the opposition, the historical opposition that existed, it says, not despite this, right? Notwithstanding this, God holds the Jews dear for the sake of their father. God himself loves in a very, very particular way his people, his chosen people, for the sake of their fathers, for the sake of Abraham and Isaac and Moses and the prophets, right? These are his people. He does not repent of the gifts that he makes. He doesn't cancel out this call that he issues to them, right? And then it says, because this was an accusation historically leveled against the entire Jewish people, that you are the ones who killed the Christ, who killed Jesus, right? And then the council addresses this very explicitly, and it says, what happened to Jesus in his passion cannot be charged against all Jews without distinction, neither those alive at that moment. It's not that every Jew at the time of Jesus wanted his death, right? And it can't be charged against all Jews today, right? So it's not that the Jews the Jewish people as a community, as a whole community, is guilty of deicide, of killing Christ, right? And so then there is an explicit call in the number. This is the number 4 is the longest document of the longest number in Nostra Aetate. It says explicitly we reject any hate and anti-Semitism on the part of the Church of Christians against the Jews, right? and foster mutual understanding, respect through biblical and theological study, right? So really, there is this great attempt to mend the fences, right? And to really respect more than respect, esteem more than esteem. I'm using those words on purpose, right? Because those are the words used with the other numbers, to really embrace our Jewish brothers with this special bond of friendship, recognizing that we come from the same group, right? That we come from the same group.
Okay, excellent. Now moving on from the Nostra Aetate to more recent things, I think there are 2 points we can bring up with John Paul II. One that kind of shows this kind of positive view of other religions, and one that shows the kind of limitations on it. So the first thing was in 1986, John Paul II had a prayer event in Assisi where leaders of different faiths all prayed to God as they understood him, or God, to their gods or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about that event and how that was showing the positive elements of the other religions?
Sure. So again, what is the context? So the council, makes this call in Nostra Aetate for mutual understanding, for respect, for dialogue, without minimizing the errors, but also a recognition of the positive elements. And really, we have the formation in 1964. In fact, actually, while the council was still in session, and actually before the final publication of Nostra Aetate, which is 1965, a year before that, 1964, Paul VI establishes the Secretariat for Non-Christians, right? And he writes an encyclical, Ecclesiam Suam, which is the first encyclical that officially calls for interreligious dialogue. Okay. In 1985, this is important. John Paul II, coming to John Paul II, he did something absolutely extraordinary. And it's important to remember just how revolutionary this action of his was. In 1965, he goes to Casablanca in Morocco at the request of King Hassan II, and he addresses more than 80,000 Muslim youth, speaking about the shared values of Christianity and Islam. Okay? In 1986, he becomes the first pope in over 1,000 years to enter into a Jewish synagogue. And he holds what you've just referred to, his famous Assisi World Day of Peace, a World Day of Prayer for Peace. Now, the event was controversial from its beginning. In fact, Cardinal Ratzinger, who was the prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, was opposed to the idea, and he made his opposition clear. He spoke to John Paul II, and he said, the risk is that it gives a relativistic idea, right? That all the religions are sort of the same, and we're all praying to God. And so it really doesn't matter. A little bit like what our question about do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? And he said, well, if we have this multi-religious prayer event, it sort of minimizes our differences and gives the impression that really we're all praying to the same God. And the only thing that differs is the language that we use, right? And so really it's just about human language that's limited, but really the notion of God and the different gods behind it are all the same. John Paul II very humbly accepted these criticisms of Ratzinger and modified the plan according to Ratzinger's proposal. And so what you have was, instead of interreligious prayer, multi-religious prayer. Now that can sound like just semantics, but what Ratzinger said is, interreligious prayer is where we all gather as one and we all pray together, providing the fiction that we all believe in the same God. And he said, no, the church should not accept, because it really is relativistic. What we have instead is multi-religious prayer. Each representative, each religious tradition prays to their God, or at least to their notion of God, in their language, according to their rites and tradition. And they pray in private. Then we come together, right? We come together. And he says, this preserves the church from this relativistic interpretation. And these events should not be the norm. They are under very exceptional circumstances, precisely when you want to give some sort of symbolic gesture of the importance of coming together and praying for peace. This was also important. What was the context? The context was to pray for peace, right? To pray and to fast for peace in the world. And so, yes, the event, let's say it generated controversy. 1986, it was repeated in 2002, and then it was repeated by Benedict in Assisi. I don't remember the year; I'd have to look it up. But during his papacy, and so these are very special events. It shouldn't be the norm, precisely because of the dangers, but the importance shouldn't be underestimated either, right? Yeah.
Okay. And then we have in 2000, you have the famous document Dominus Jesus from the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, signed off by Cardinal Ratzinger and approved by the Pope, which really pointed out both how like the non-Christians can be saved, but also the differences between them, that Jesus is the only true way to heaven. That's what the Dominus Jesus, the Lord Jesus, as the title refers back to. Can you give a little overview of that and how it relates to this idea of the Christian relationship with other religions?
Right. So I think to understand the importance and the need for Dominus Jesus, we have to sort of very generally understand what happened after the council in the 35 years after the council, because of the new attitude of the church towards these other religions, specifically in Nostra Aetate, which said Nostra Aetate is very short and it only speaks, for better or for worse, about the religions in positive terms, right? And so what happened in Catholic theology in this effort to improve dialogue and improve relationships with other religions after the council, and always claiming authority on based on Nostra Aetate, was that several theologians started to go down increasingly relativistic routes, right? So they increasingly started to say that all religions are the word that was used, and as if this word explains everything, is that the religions were more or less equal, right? More or less equally valid paths leading up to the mystery of God, more or less equally salvific, etc., etc. And I don't want to get too technical over here and start mentioning names. Perhaps the most famous, I'll just mention two names. Perhaps the most famous are John Hick, and he spoke very famously about the need to move beyond Christocentricity and to speak about God-centeredness. We're all centered on God, and the church and Christ are just points of division. Ultimately, he even said that we have to abandon discourse about God, because there are religions that are non-theistic, like certain forms of Buddhism or Hinduism. And so we need to talk about reality-centeredness. And then another theologian who should be mentioned in this context perhaps is Paul Nitter. He studied here in Rome at the Gregorian, then left the priesthood. And his whole theology was that, look, all these discourses about who God is he Christ, is he Allah, is he Krishna, is he the Buddha? All of this is not important. All of these distinctions don't help. What really is important is social work and what the religions do together for justice and peace and care for the environment. And so with Paul Nitter, you have a fusion of what we call theology of religions, study of religions, with liberation theology. And that became very popular. So really, the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith under Cardinal Ratzinger, under the papacy of John Paul II in the year 2000, felt it necessary to publish a clarification, Dominus Jesus, the Lord Jesus. There really is nothing new from a theological or doctrinal magisterial point of view. There is nothing new in this document. It simply repeats what has always been Christian doctrine. We believe that Jesus truly is God, We believe that he is the one savior and mediator of all human beings. And we believe that he founded the church as an instrument for salvation, as the only instrument for salvation. I mentioned, perhaps this is the place to bring this up very briefly again, that the earlier interpretation of extra ecclesia nulla salus, of there is no salvation outside the Catholic Church, that dogma, the earlier interpretation was negative and restrictive. Those who are not members of the church cannot be saved. One of the big developments of the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium 14 is that it said that dogma should be interpreted not in negative and restrictive terms, but in causal terms. What does that mean? Everyone who is saved through the church. The church is the instrument of salvation for all men and women, Christian and non-Christian alike. For Christians, of course, the means of communication of the grace of Christ, of the Father, through Christ and through the church are the sacraments. Those are the ordinary means. For those who are not members of the church, how does this grace from the Father, through Christ and through the church arrive to them? The Council does not give an answer. It leaves it open for theological reflection. And in other numbers, it says, it sort of hints at saying that the means that God uses are known to him alone. But it's always through the church, through the mediation of the church, even if we don't know exactly how that is occurred, right? So Dominus Jesus simply repeats that. It says, Christ is necessary for salvation, and the church is necessary for salvation. That doesn't mean that someone who is not a baptized Christian through no fault of their own is going to be condemned. It means that this person can be saved, but can be saved through graces that are arriving to him through the church, even if we don't know exactly how this has occurred. But we have to hold as a matter of faith that Christ and the church are necessary for the salvation of all men and women, Christian and non-Christian alike. So that's the context of Dominus Jesus. In and of itself, it's simply a repetition of what the church has always believed and what the council taught, right? But it was necessary precisely because in the 35 years after the council, Catholic theology had in certain cases, and sometimes very important cases, sort of gone off the bend, right? And so it was necessary to clarify.
Okay.
Things.
Yeah. So just as a conclusion, you wrote a book called Ratzinger on Religious Pluralism, which will include a link to buy in the show notes. And so I just want you to explain that book and explain a little bit about Ratzinger or Pope Benedict XVI's views on other religions. And what can we say about it that hasn't already been covered? Because we've covered a lot of stuff already. But what does Ratzinger have to say that we haven't already covered?
Okay, well, so what I trace is his whole engagement with this theme from before the council, during the council, after the council, and then in the 2000s. So if you want to really understand through Ratzinger's thought, the engagement of the pre-conciliar and post-conciliar church with these themes, which are very complicated. And in this podcast, I understand we can only touch upon them at a very generic level. Then that's explained much better in the in the book. What Ratzinger really points out is something that is mentioned in the council, but has not been picked up by theology afterwards, which is that the positive elements in these religions, remember we talked about positive and negative elements, but it says the positive elements in these religions really are preparations for the gospel. They are seeds of the word that are meant to prepare the way for Christ. And so these religions are, if you want, they have an Advent character. They are on the way. They are not meant to be permanent resting places. They are, in that sense, analogous to Israel. Israel is a preparation for the coming of Christ. And these religions, therefore, are also on the way. They are preparing the state, if you will, for Christ. Of course, that preparation, those positive elements have been mixed in with negative elements and so have to be purified. Perhaps the most audacious part of Ratzinger's theology and proposal is that this process of purification and enrichment and elevation does not occur only to the religions, but also in a certain sense, in an analogous sense, and in a more limited sense, but it also happens to the church in its meeting with the other religions. Now, what does that mean? It means, let's take, since we talked about Islam, and perhaps more than theory, what I'll give you as an example, and then the theory is explained in the book. And there are lots of more examples in the book. If you have ever entered into a mosque and seen Muslims pray, and I've done that on several occasions, what is very clear, what immediately strikes you, because the prayers, the words, the gestures, the actions, everything transmits the idea that God really is God. That we are creatures standing before the omnipotent, the almighty, that we are on holy ground, right? Sometimes going into a Catholic church, I ask myself, are Catholics really aware that when they come to church, when they come to Mass, for example, that they are encountering God? Are they filled with this holy fear and reverence that the Muslims have? So in the encounter with Islam, are we going to learn some new element of faith that's going to correct our Christian understanding of God? No. Any positive element that they have, we already have, right? And any positive element they have is a preparation to the fullness that is found in the Catholic Church. But the way in which they live this out at the human level, the historical expression and understanding of this, can we learn again in contact with them about those elements of the faith, that of our own faith, of the true faith, of the Catholic faith, that perhaps we've not been living, or not been living sufficiently, or that we need to be reminded of and think again about how to put this in practice? Well, perhaps yes, right? Perhaps yes. And so can the encounter with the religions be not only a help to those religions to find their fullness in Christ, obviously, but can it also be a help to us to discover the richness of our faith, not only in a negative sense of we don't have these errors, but positively? Can it also be a help to us? Yes, it can. And perhaps God permits the other religions precisely in this way to be helps for us in the living of our faith as a historical community, right? That's explained a lot more in the book. And the other element that I'm not going to get into because it's going to take too much time is, I said that the council didn't explain how grace is arriving to the non-baptized, right? It says that it passes from Christ through the church to the non-baptized. The council doesn't say this is the formula. This is how it happens. It leaves it open to theologians to investigate. Ratzinger provides an explanation. It's not official church teaching. It's the teaching of a theologian, but he provides his explanation of how that is happening. And it's a beautiful explanation who the vicarious representations of Christians who stand for their brothers, who represent their brothers, above all in the Eucharist, just as Christ represents all of us, all of humanity in his sacrifice on the cross. I won't say more about that over here. But those are themes that are dealt with much more in the book.
Thank you very much, Father Samir. For those of you who are wanting it, Father Samir's book will be linked in the show notes. We had a little long today, but thank you for being here, Father Samir. And to our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help Starcross produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly to join the Starcross Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to start reading Nostra Aetate. We're going to begin with paragraph 1 on religious answers seem unsolvable. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which will provide a blueprint for the Catholic Church. Go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X for more information on the podcast, such as playlists and a reading plan. There's also an SQPN Discord with a channel for Vatican II in a Year, and you can find that at sqpn.com/Discord.
Very good. Thank you, Father Matthew. Thank you for having me.